The autumn rain came down like something personal, not weather, a verdict. It turned the red clay into a slick, bleeding wound across the earth, swallowed tire tracks whole, drowned boot prints the moment they were made. The wasteland, a stretch of eroded hills and dead brush, 60 miles from anything that had a name, became a place that didn't want to be survived. 7 Navy SEALs were moving through it anyway. Their radio had been giving them static for the last 40 minutes. Not silent static, the particular kind that sounds like something breathing on the other end. They didn't know yet. They were thinking about the mission, about the engineer, about extraction windows and grid coordinates, and the team leader's last words before insertion. We go in fast, we come out faster, and we don't leave anyone behind. They didn't know the ground had already chosen them. They didn't know the kill zone was waiting. And they certainly didn't know that somewhere out there beyond the rain, beyond the ridge, beyond any point marked on any map, a single pair of eyes was already watching, had been watching, was counting. Not them. What was coming for them? The briefing had been clean. Almost too clean. Lieutenant Commander Decker Harlow had stood in front of the satellite imagery for a long time before saying anything. The photos showed a compound, low walls, 2 structures, a vehicle parked at an angle that suggested recent movement. A man named Gerald Oakes, a structural engineer contracted to assess infrastructure in the region, had been taken 48 hours earlier. No demands had been issued. That alone was the part that made Harlow's neck go tight. No demands meant they weren't keeping Oakes for leverage. They were keeping him for something else. We have a narrow window, the intelligence officer had said. Her name was Patricia Voss, and she had the practiced calm of someone who had delivered bad news so many times it had stopped registering as anything other than data. Satellite pass at 0200 suggests reduced perimeter. 6 hostiles, maybe 8. The compound sits in a natural depression. Good cover on approach from the North Ridge. Harlow had looked at. He hadn't said what he was thinking, which was, that's also good cover if someone wants to hold people inside it. He'd asked about SIGINT. Voss said clean, no radio traffic in the last 12 hours. He'd asked about human intelligence assets in the area. Voss said none active. He'd asked whether anyone had done a ground truth sweep of the approach corridor, and she had looked at him with the careful patience of someone who had run into this question before and had a rehearsed answer. The satellite imagery is current as of 6 hours ago. Conditions are consistent with insertion. 6 hours is a long time. He'd taken the mission anyway. There was a man out there who was alive or wasn't, and sitting in the base asking better questions wasn't going to change that. Now, moving through the rain with 6 men behind him, he turned that image over in his mind, the way you turn a stone looking for what lives underneath. The briefing had been clean. The imagery had been clean. The intelligence had been clean. He had been in this business long enough to know that clean briefings in complex terrain were one of 2 things, either genuinely clean or the surface of something that had been prepared to look a certain way. He was working out which one this was. The team was compact. 7 men, loaded light for speed. Sergeant First Class Caleb Rutherford moved at Harlow's left shoulder, a decade of fieldwork written into the way he walked, low and quiet, reading the ground like a language. He was 38 and had more deployments than he had any interest in counting. His left hand bore a scar from a piece of wire he never talked about. He had a daughter in Colorado who was 12 years old and sent him photographs of her drawings by email. He had told Harlow once, in a moment of uncharacteristic openness during a long wait at a forward operating base, that the drawings were the thing he was most careful not to think about during operations. Too vivid, too real. They pulled at concentration in ways that a professional couldn't afford. Behind them, Corporal Dean Whitfield, 26, the youngest on the team, fresh enough that he still tensed at the wrong moments, but experienced enough to know he tensed at the wrong moments. He was working on it. Every mission, he was working on it. He had been engaged for 4 months to a woman named Amanda Burgess, who taught 2nd grade and who had sent him off at the airport with what she called a very calm goodbye and then cried the whole drive home, which he knew because she had told him about it in a letter, and the honesty of it had made him love her more precisely. The medic was Staff Sergeant Norman Price, a lean, precise man who had the unusual quality of being excellent at 2 things that seemed to contradict each other: keeping people alive and remaining completely calm while doing it. He carried more kit than anyone else and moved like it weighed nothing. His hands were the most important tools on this team, and he treated them accordingly. No unnecessary risks, nothing that could compromise the steadiness of those hands. The rest of the team had absorbed this as a practical understanding. Price would do what he needed to do to keep those hands intact and operational, and they did not give him grief about it, because those hands had saved 4 members of this team across 3 separate engagements, and the debt was well established. The remaining 3 gunnery, Sergeant Alec Foster, Petty Officer First Class Roy Hutchins, and Corporal James Weld, spread behind in a staggered column, weapons up, eyes sweeping the gray. Foster was 41, the oldest, with the weathered patience of someone who had stopped finding missions exciting somewhere around deployment number 7 and now approached them with the professional thoroughness of a skilled tradesman. Hutchins was 34 and quiet, in a way that new team members sometimes mistook for unfriendliness, but was actually just economy. He said things when they needed to be said and was silent when silence was more efficient. Weld was 24. He had the kind of easy physical confidence that young men in peak condition carry without knowing they carry it. He had been in 3 firefights in his career. This would be different from all of them. The rain was heavier than forecast. It turned the air white at distances past 30 meters, collapsed the horizon to a gray smear, and filled every dip in the earth with cold water that pulled at their boots. The radio crackled. Harlow lifted a fist. The column stopped. He pressed the receiver. Nothing but static. He waited. The static breathed. Command. This is Harlow. Come in. Silence. Command. Acknowledge. The static breathed again and said nothing. Rutherford appeared at his elbow. Same as 10 minutes ago? Same as 10 minutes ago. Terrain interference? Harlow looked at the ridgeline. They were entering the valley approach, the geography that funneled toward the compound. He'd seen this on the satellite image. He'd noted it as a communication dead zone and logged it as acceptable risk. He kept moving. Foresight requires information you don't always have. The ground got softer as they descended. The brush thinned. The rain collected into rivulets along the natural contours, running dark and fast over the clay. The smell of the earth changed wetter, deeper, the particular dark smell of ground that had been saturated past its limit and was giving up water rather than holding it. Whitfield, behind him, stepped into a puddle that went to his knee. He pulled free without a sound. Getting better. Harlow checked his compass, checked the ridge, checked the invisible sky. The compound should be 400 meters ahead. The objective was 48 hours old and still breathing, if they were lucky. The window was... He stopped. Something on the ground. Not mud, not water. He crouched, pressed 2 fingers into the earth beside a depression that didn't fit the landscape. Boot print, recent, pointed the wrong direction. Not toward the compound, away from it. He stood. He looked at the rain. He thought about the depression, the natural walls, the absence of demands. He thought about the clean briefing. 1 boot print, pointed wrong, was nothing. Could be anything, could be old. He looked closer. The print had definition. The edges were still sharp under the rain, which meant it was less than 15 minutes old. The tread pattern was consistent with military-grade footwear. Someone had been standing here. Someone had turned around and walked the other way. Someone had been here recently. Move, he thought. Fast. Move, he said. Fast. He wasn't fast enough. The first structure they reached was the outer marker, a ruined concrete block building that the satellite image had shown as collapsed. It was collapsed. What the image hadn't shown was what was inside the collapse. 3 armed men in position, patient, motionless, waiting in the rubble like stones. They were good. Professional-grade discipline, not local irregular fighters. Someone had trained them. The IED was in the doorframe of the second structure, a pressure plate buried under 3 inches of wet clay, invisible to anyone moving fast, in the rain, toward an objective. Rutherford saw it. He shouted 1 word, down. The blast was directional, channeled by the concrete walls to the left, and it took Weld off his feet and dropped Foster hard into the mud. The percussion hit everyone else like a closed fist. Harlow's ears went to a single high tone and stayed there for a long, bad second. Then the fire started. It came from 3 directions simultaneously: the collapsed building, the ridge to the right, and something low in the brush to their west, a position that should have been open ground, was marked as open ground, but had been prepared. Dugouts. Pre-positioned fighters who had been there long enough that the rain had flattened the disturbed earth back to normal. 8 hostiles. Possibly 12. Harlow had 3 seconds to understand what had happened. The compound had always been a prop, a photograph for intelligence to find. The real objective had always been the valley approach. This valley, this terrain, this natural funnel. Oaks might be real, Oaks might be dead already. It didn't matter anymore. What mattered was that his team was in a kill zone and the walls were closing. "On me!" he shouted into the noise. "Move to the gully northwest, move!" They moved. They were good men and they moved without hesitation, even though 2 of them were shaking off percussion effects and the rain was now loud enough to compete with the gunfire. Foster scrambled upright, weld bleeding from his forearm. Face white, got up and ran. They broke contact from the initial position and reached the gully. It was shallow. It was wet. It was the best cover they had. Harlow pressed against the claybank and did a count. 7, all 7, for now. He keyed the radio. Static. He keyed it again. Static. He switched channels. Static across every band. Someone was jamming them. That meant this operation had coordination behind it, equipment, planning, forward intelligence. Someone had known they were coming before they had finished loading the helicopters. Rutherford was beside him, reading his face. Bad? Very bad. Options? Harlow looked northwest, then east. The rain collapsed both directions to gray. Movement everywhere, shapes in the swell of the terrain. Hostile silhouettes appearing and vanishing in the downpour. "We fight our way to high ground," he said. "That ridge. We get elevation. We signal when the jamming breaks." "And if the jamming doesn't break?" Harlow looked at him. Rutherford nodded once. He understood. They started moving. The ridge was 200 meters. It might as well have been 2 miles. The hostiles were using the terrain like people who had trained in it, moving along the reverse slopes, appearing where the natural dips in the earth provided cover, never holding position long enough to be fixed. They were pushing the SEALs northeast, toward the open ground, the flat exposed stretch that Harlow had noted on the satellite image as the compound's outer perimeter. They were hurting them. Every time the team tried to push northwest toward higher ground, fire came from that direction. Every time they tried to break east, the pressure increased. The only direction that remained open was the direction they didn't want to go. Weld went down again at the 40-meter mark. Price was there before Harlow had finished turning field dressing already out, hands moving with the particular economy of someone who had done this in worse conditions. "Through and through, forearm," he said without looking up. "Arterial's fine. He can move." Weld moved. He was pale and his teeth were set, but he moved. Hutchins was returning fire at 3 o'clock, controlled bursts. Deliberate, no panic. 6 hostiles on the east ridge, he called. Maybe 8. And there's more south. They're stacking up. "How much ammunition?" Harlow asked. The count came back. They were down to roughly 40% of loadout. The firefight had been less than 12 minutes. Whitfield, pressed against a chunk of broken earth at Harlow's right, had his weapon up, but Harlow could see the young corporal's jaw working. Not panic, not yet. Something more controlled, and therefore more honest. Fear that hadn't had time to become familiar. "Whitfield, talk to me. What do you see?" It was deliberate. Give him something to do with his mind. Harlow watched the young man's breathing change as he shifted from feeling to observing. "Northeast is open, but I count at least 4 positions. South is closing, maybe 6, moving up. The gully runs another 30 meters before it goes flat." He paused. "Sir, if they reach that flat section before we do, they won't." He wasn't sure that was true. He said it anyway. They pushed northeast, fighting for every meter, trading fire they couldn't afford for ground they needed. The rain hammered down without mercy, filling every hole, turning every surface to a sliding sheet of red mud. At the 80-meter mark, the gully ended. In front of them, a low mound, a natural hump of earth, maybe 20 meters across, surrounded on 3 sides by flat, open ground. The kind of feature that looks like cover until you realize there's no way out of it. The kind of feature that a military tactician would call, in neutral professional language, a fatal ground. Harlow stopped at the edge of the gully and looked at it. He had run the options already. He ran them again. They came out the same. "We hold here," he said. "We make them come to us. We make every round count." Foster started to say something. Stopped. Behind them, the rain filled the silence with its own language. The loudspeaker came on at hour 1. A male voice, calm, unhurried, speaking in accented English with the particular patience of someone who has prepared what he's going to say. "You are surrounded. There is no extraction coming. Lay down your weapons and you will be treated according to the rules of war. Resistance is futile. You have 10 minutes. The voice repeated it twice and went silent. Harlow said nothing. Nobody on the team said anything. The rain had gotten worse driving now, nearly horizontal, turning visibility to less than 20 meters, which was the only reason they hadn't been overrun already. It was the only thing working for them. Price was working on weld again. The first dressing had soaked through and the temperature was dropping. He changed it with hands that moved steadily and said nothing, because there was nothing useful to say, and Price had long ago understood the difference between words that served a purpose and words that just made the speaker feel less helpless. Weld was conscious. He watched Price work and said, "How bad? You'll keep the arm." That's the good news version. That is the good news version. Weld almost smiled. Almost. The ammunition count had dropped to 20%. Harlow had quietly redistributed what they had Rutherford and Hutchins at the forward positions, carrying the heaviest loadout, the rest of the team conserving for close engagement. When close engagement came, the distance would be measured in meters rather than hundreds of meters, and the math would be ugly. The rain hit the earth with the sound of something relentless and indifferent. Harlow pressed himself against the mud mound and thought about his daughter. She was 8. She had a gap in her front teeth that she was furious about and refused to smile wide enough to show, but kept showing anyway because she forgot to be furious about it when she laughed. She had asked him, the last morning before deployment, whether he would be home for her birthday. He had told her yes. He had believed it when he said it. He thought about his wife, Carolyn, the way she stood at the kitchen counter in the morning, both hands around her coffee, looking out the window at the yard with the expression of someone quietly deciding something. He had never asked her what she was deciding. He wished he had. He thought about the men around him. Rutherford, who had a daughter too and coached her soccer team on the weekends he was home. Whitfield, who had gotten engaged 4 months ago to a woman named Amanda who taught 2nd grade. Foster, who was 41 and had told Harlow once, drunk at a base bar in the middle of nowhere, that he planned to retire and open a bait shop in North Carolina. Hutchins, who hadn't spoken about his personal life in 5 years, and whose silence on the subject Harlow had long since learned to read as a privacy worth respecting. Price, who had 2 kids and a wife who was a nurse, and who had told Harlow with complete seriousness that he thought the best marriage advice was to always be the one who does the dishes. Weld, bleeding quietly in the mud, 24 years old, with a life that had barely started. Harlow looked at his weapon. 14 rounds. He looked at the mound, the flat ground around it, the shapes moving in the rain. He thought about last stands, about what they cost, about whether they meant anything or whether they were just the last thing that happened before the quiet. He thought, if this is it, then let it be clean, let it be fast, let them come at us from the front. On my signal, he said quietly, we make them pay for every inch. He tightened his grip, and then, the sound wasn't where it should have been. A rifle shot in a firefight has a direction. It comes from somewhere left, right, front, back. It exists in space. This one didn't. It came from above, from distance, from a direction that the terrain made impossible because there was nothing out there but rain and open ground and the empty horizon. The hostile commander, the one standing at the south edge of the flat, directing the advance with arm signals dropped without sound. One moment upright, the next on the ground, and the movement was so clean and so final that the first reaction of the fighters around him wasn't to seek cover, but to look at him, the way you look at something you don't yet understand. 2 seconds of perfect, confused silence. Harlow had flattened by instinct. He looked at Rutherford. Rutherford looked back. Neither man said anything because there was no protocol for what had just happened. The second shot came 3 seconds after the first. Another hostile, northwest edge of the encirclement. A man who had been moving forward, low, using the natural dip in the ground. He dropped mid-step. The shot had traveled what Harlow estimated at 800 meters minimum through driving rain and horizontal wind. The encircling forces froze. Not for long. They were trained. But the freeze was real, and it cost them the momentum that had been building for 45 minutes. The third shot came before any of them had relocated. Harlow pressed to the side of the mound and scanned with desperate concentration, trying to find the angle, trying to work backward from the geometry of the hits. The commander had been to the south. The northwest man had been to the northwest. The third had been east. 3 different targets. 3 different angular relationships to whatever the shooting position was. He couldn't make it work. The math didn't resolve. The angle was... "That's not a human position," Rutherford said beside him, and his voice was very quiet and very precise. "Whatever ridge that came from there is no ridge there. There's something. There is nothing. I checked that ground on ingress. I checked it twice. A 4th shot. A 5th. Whitfield was watching the enemy lines with his mouth open, not in fear, in pure disbelief. "They're not finding it," he said. "They're running and they're not finding it." He was right. The hostiles were doing what trained fighters do under sniper fire, breaking into small groups, moving at angles, trying to make themselves harder to track. It wasn't working. Every time a cluster of them consolidated long enough to coordinate, one of them dropped. Not randomly. Sequentially. Methodically. The shots were picking apart the command structure, the fighters who were giving orders, the fighters carrying the communications equipment, the fighters positioned to direct flanking movement. Whatever was out there wasn't just shooting. It was dismantling an organization. Hutchins, forward of Harlow's position, turned back with an expression that Harlow had never seen on the man's face before. Something between awe and alarm. "I've never seen accuracy like that. Not in any condition. Certainly not in this." "Distance?" Harlow asked. "Best I can estimate 900. Maybe more. In this wind." Hutchins paused. "That's not physically possible. Tell that to whoever's doing it." Foster, from the right side of the mound, "Could be an asset we don't know about. Air support? No air in this weather. And the sound's wrong for a support platform." "Then what?" "I don't know," Harlow said. And then, more quietly, to himself, more quietly than anything, "We are not alone." He had thought they were. He had made his peace with what that meant. He had been wrong. The shooting continued. It had a pattern, not random, not frantic. Measured, the intervals between shots were consistent, not so short as to suggest urgency, not so long as to suggest repositioning. Whatever was firing was stationary, had been stationary, had chosen a position and trusted it, and was now working through targets with the unhurried precision of someone who had calculated everything in advance. The hostile forces tried 3 different approaches to locate it. First, they sent 2 men in a wide arc to the south, trying to find the back angle, to catch the trajectory from behind. Both men reached the southern ridgeline and stopped, scanned, reported back. Nothing. Open ground, no position. They came back looking uncertain in a way that soldiers almost never look. Second, they brought up their own optics, a man with a high magnification scope trying to read the ballistic signature backward from the kill zone geometry. He worked at it for almost a minute. Then a shot came and he was no longer working at it. The third approach was volume fire. They laid down suppressive rounds in the general direction of the estimated origin point, a 20-meter arc across empty ground, 800 meters out. The rain turned the muzzle flashes into brief orange smears. Dirt kicked up. Mud. Nothing else. The return shot came 11 seconds after the suppressive fire stopped. It was the most patient 11 seconds Harlow had ever waded through. Whitfield, watching from Harlow's right, "It's not moving." Why isn't it moving? If they're sending people around. Because it doesn't need to. Harlow kept watching. It's already solved the problem. Moving would just introduce new variables. Rutherford was quiet for a moment. Then, the angle shifts on every shot, different by 2-3 degrees, but the origin point stays consistent. He worked through it. It's not repositioning between shots. It's adjusting hold for each target. Individual ballistic solutions, each one, without breaking position. The rain came down. The clock kept moving. One of the hostile fighters began to retreat, not running, walking backward, the way someone walks when the ground beneath them has changed from solid to something they no longer trust. Another joined him. Then 3 more. They weren't routing. They were reassessing. There's a difference, but the grip was loosening. The noose that had been drawing tight was no longer drawing tight. Harlow felt something he hadn't expected to feel, not relief, not yet. Something more specific. The feeling of a door opening in a room that had been sealed. Foster, beside him now. What is that? What is that? I don't know, Harlow said. That's not a drone. That's not a support asset. That's not an automated system. Something is physically out there, making individual target decisions in real time, at 900 meters, in this weather, and nobody can see it. I know. That's not. I know what it's not, Harlow said. I don't know what it is. And right now that's fine. Right now that's exactly fine. He began to think. Not about survival, about movement. About the gap that was opening in the encirclement. About where it was opening and why and what it meant. Someone was making a path. Harlow had coordinated with forward air support, with armor, with indigenous partners who spoke 4 different languages. He had worked with allies he'd never met across comms that kept breaking. He had coordinated under fire, with people who were scared, and people who were hurt, and people who had no idea what was happening. He had never coordinated with a ghost, but the ghost was coordinating with him. The pattern was too deliberate to be coincidence. Each shot cleared a specific position, not the nearest hostile, not the easiest target, but the one that mattered most for a 7-man team trying to move northeast. The suppression was surgical, and it was directional, and it was creating, methodically, a corridor through terrain that had been a kill zone 20 minutes ago. Harlow watched 3 more shots. He watched where they landed. He watched the gap. Northwest, he said. We move northwest. Now. Rutherford, that's uphill. Into the fire lane. The fire lane moved. Look. Rutherford looked. He looked for a long moment. He understood. Whitfield. Harlow turned. You take point. Move hard and low. Bear northwest. Don't stop unless you take contact. You hear me? Whitfield's jaw was set. The fear was still there. It would be there until this was over. That's what honest fear looks like, but it wasn't running him. Yes, sir. They moved. The timing was precise in a way that shouldn't have been possible without radio contact. As the team broke cover and began their push northwest, 3 shots dropped, the fighters positioned to intercept them not all at once, sequentially, each one timed to a specific point in the team's advance. When Foster slipped in the mud and lost 2 seconds, the shot that would have opened the right flank came 2 seconds later, as if something had seen him slip and accounted for it. Whitfield was moving fast, bent low, reading the ground with his whole body. Price had Weld's good arm over his shoulder, moving at a half run, the wounded man keeping up on willpower and controlled pain. The shots continued. Not every second there were gaps where the rain and the silence filled in and Harlow's chest tightened. Then another shot, another position cleared, another meter of corridor held open. Hutchins took a round through his vest. Body armor stopped it, but the impact sat him down hard. Harlow was there, pulling him up, moving. Hutchins got his legs under him and ran. At the 100-meter mark, Whitfield reached the base of the rise higher ground, natural cover, a shelf of rock that the rain turned into a curtain of water, but that provided real concealment for the first time since the ambush. He turned and made a fist. Stop here. The team compressed into cover. Count. 7. All 7. Harlow pressed his back against the rock and breathed. His heart was running fast and he let it. He had earned the fast heart. He let it run and he breathed and he counted his people. Rutherford appeared at his shoulder, water streaming from his helmet brim. We got through. We got through. How much of that was us? Harlow looked back at the flat ground below. The hostiles had regrouped, pulling back from the forward positions, consolidating, trying to reread the situation. They weren't pursuing. Something was keeping them from pursuing. Enough of it was us, he said. The rest. He looked toward the ridge, toward the open ground beyond the ridge, toward nothing. The rest was something else. Rutherford followed his gaze, said nothing. From somewhere out in the rain and the dark, in a direction that still couldn't be made to make sense on any map, a single shot sounded. Then quiet. Harlow had a particular kind of memory, not photographic, but tactical. He retained patterns, sequences, the geometry of things. It was what made him good at what he did, and it was what was now running in the back of his mind like a program he hadn't consciously opened. 3 shots, pause, 2 shots, pause, 3 shots. He'd heard that pattern before. Not in person, in a debrief. A report he'd read 3 years ago during an advanced tactics course, a case study in unconventional operations, pulled from files that were so heavily redacted the tactical picture had to be inferred from what remained. A series of operations, in a different theater, different year, same climate of rain and mud, and impossible geometry. The subject of the case study had no name in the file. The file referred to him as Subject 7. The instructor had called him something else. The instructor had called him the Pattern Man, because every engagement attributed to him showed the same signature. A 3 count, arrest, a 2 count, arrest, and then the clean conclusion. Not a habit, a discipline. The spacing wasn't random. It was a counting rhythm. 3 breaths, 2 breaths, final breath. The instructor, a retired command sergeant major named Leonard Graves, who had the delivery of a man who had stopped caring what people thought of him somewhere around year 15, had presented the case study with the same flat neutrality he brought to everything. No drama, no embellishment. Just facts laid end to end like stones in a path, and the accumulated weight of those facts speaking for itself. The facts were these. Over a period of 11 months in a theater Graves would not specify, 9 separate Allied engagements that had been moving toward catastrophic loss had been reversed by unidentified long-range fire support. The reversals followed a consistent pattern. The fire would begin when the Allied force had exhausted conventional options, would demonstrate targeting precision that exceeded documented human performance parameters, would continue for a period precisely sufficient to alter the tactical situation, and would then cease. No subject was ever identified. No physical evidence was recovered. In 2 cases, Allied commanders had dispatched teams to investigate the origin points after engagements. Both teams reached the location and found nothing. Not disturbed, nothing. Truly nothing. Ground that showed no sign of recent occupation. One commander had written in his after-action report, "The origin point shows no evidence of human presence. The terrain itself provides no viable firing position. We are unable to account for the fire support described in this report and recommend the matter be referred to specialist analysis." The specialist analysis, if it had ever been conducted, was not in the file. Graves had presented all of this without inflection. Then he had closed the folder and looked at the class and said, "I am not going to tell you what to think about this. I am going to tell you that the operational outcomes were real. The men who came home because of them are real. And whatever you believe about the cause, the effect is documented." A student in the back, a young officer named Harlow, had asked, "Does anyone know who it is?" Graves had looked at him for a moment that went slightly longer than comfortable. "There are names in circulation," Graves had said. "I don't use them. Using a name gives you the feeling of understanding something you don't understand. It's more honest to say, there is a pattern. The pattern has continued for an unknown number of years. The pattern shows no signs of stopping. That's what we know." That was what Harlow knew. It was enough to count. 3 shots, pause, 2 shots, pause, 3 shots. The Pattern Man. In this rain, on this ridge, watching a kill zone that hadn't been a kill zone until today. Rutherford. Yeah. 3, 2, 3. A long pause. Rutherford's expression changed in a way that was not easy to describe. It crossed from confusion through recognition and kept going to something that had no comfortable name. "You're not. Count them. From the beginning." Rutherford was quiet for a moment. His lips moved. He counted. He stopped. He looked at Harlow. "That's not possible," he said. "Tell me something I don't know." "That man, I know. They said he was. I know what they said. Nobody's seen him in 4 years. There's no record. There's nothing. He doesn't exist." Harlow looked out at the rain, at the open ground where the impossible shots had come from, at the empty distance. "No," he said. "He doesn't." He said the name then, quietly, the way you say a name when you're not sure you should be saying it out loud. The kind of name that lives in the margins of reports that mostly get redacted. It wasn't a famous name. It wasn't a name that appeared in any public record or citation, roll or memorial. It was just a name, 2 syllables that a small number of people in the professional community had heard in connection with events they couldn't explain and had then filed away in the part of the mind reserved for things that can't be processed in the usual way. Whitfield, nearby, heard it. He looked at Harlow. Who? Harlow looked at him for a moment. Then, nobody. Keep moving. The extraction window was closing. Harlow had managed to raise a fragmented signal on one channel. Not command, not the designated frequency, but a military aviation band that caught a piece of the helicopter's transponder. The signal was degraded and inconsistent and transmitted in broken pieces through the jamming. But it was real. A helicopter was in the air. It was looking for them. They had maybe 20 minutes before the weather forced it back. The problem was, the ground between their current position and the pickup zone, 600 meters of open terrain that the hostile forces were now crossing in force. Whatever had been suppressing them from the ridgeline above had apparently stopped, or moved, or was waiting. The encirclement wasn't as tight as before, but it was reorganizing. The forces that had been broken apart by the sniper fire were pulling back together, folding into a new formation, pushing up the northeast slope with the patience of people who now knew they had a limited window to act before outside assets arrived. Harlow laid it out for the team in 30 seconds. 600 meters, open ground, low brush for the first half. Pickup zone is the flat area. At the northeast marker, drone identified it as clear. We are going to move fast, and we are going to move all the way through. No stopping. Weld, can you run? Weld, pale, jaw tight. Yes. You run on your own or Price is next to you the whole time. Your call. I run on my own. Good. Hutchins, Foster, your rear guard. You give us 30 seconds of covering fire if we need it, and then you follow. Don't wait for me. Follow the team to the LZ. Copy. Whitfield, you're on point again. You set the pace. Whitfield nodded. He'd stopped looking scared. Not because the fear was gone, but because the fear had found its proper place, present but contained, a tool rather than a condition. Harlow had watched it happen over the course of the last 2 hours. The young man would be different after this. That was the price of this kind of night. On my count, Harlow said. 3, 2. The shot came from behind them. From the ridge. From the impossible direction. It dropped the lead hostile on the eastern approach, the man who had been setting the pace for the reorganization, whose position and movement had been defining the geometry of the new encirclement. He dropped, and the formation behind him lost its forward anchor. 2 more shots followed in rapid succession, both on the eastern approach, both removing fighters who were positioned to cut off the northeast corridor. The path was there again. Go, Harlow said. They went. 600 meters in a driving rain. On ground that wanted to take them down, with a wounded man and depleted ammunition and noise from every direction. Whitfield ran like something was burning behind him. The team followed in a compressed column, close enough that Harlow could see each man's breath in the cold. At the 300-meter mark, fire came from the south long range, inaccurate in the wind, but real. Hutchins and Foster turned and returned fire. Not much, enough. A shot from behind and above. The southern fire stopped. At the 400-meter mark, Weld stumbled. Price caught him. They kept running. At the 500, the ground dipped into a shallow channel and the brush closed around them, and for 30 meters, they were invisible to everything, moving through a natural trench that the rain had cut into the earth over years and that none of them had known was there. The channel ran exactly northeast. It ran like it had been planned. At the 580-meter mark, Whitfield broke out onto the flat. The helicopter was there, its running lights strobing through the rain, the rotors hammering the air with a sound that was the best sound any of them had ever heard. Go, go, go. They piled in, Rutherford last aboard, pulling the door. Harlow, standing at the edge of the flat, watching the rearguard Hutchins in first. Foster in, door closing, everyone. He paused. 1 second, 2. He looked back at the wasteland. At the rain. At the ridge. At nothing. Nothing. He got in the helicopter. The door sealed. The ground fell away beneath them, dropping into the rain and the dark and the mud. Nobody spoke for a long time. The after-action report was filed 48 hours later. It documented the ambush, the engagement, the casualties, Weld's wound, Hutchins' bruised ribs from the vest impact, minor injuries across the team. It documented the jamming, the loss of communications, the improvised extraction. It documented the trajectory of the engagement and the shift in hostile behavior that had enabled the team's withdrawal. It did not document a sniper. Not because Harlow omitted it. He didn't omit it. He wrote it exactly as it had occurred. Unidentified fire support from an estimated 900-meter position at unknown bearing, approximately 47 rounds across 63 minutes. 0 misses, 0 identification of shooter. The report was reviewed. The section on fire support was returned to him with a note. The note said, "No Allied assets were operating in the area. No aircraft, no ground support. Please clarify the source of fire support described in section 4.3. Harlow wrote back, "I cannot clarify it. I am reporting what occurred." The section was removed from the official record. Not quietly, formally. A notation that said the fire support data was inconclusive and could not be corroborated and was therefore not included in the final operational summary. The people who made that decision wrote it with the particular confidence of people who have never been in a kill zone at hour 2. Harlow sat with the redacted report for a long time. Then he went looking. The classified archive took 4 separate access requests and a week of waiting. What he found, or rather, what he found the absence of, was the file on Subject 7. The case study he remembered from the tactics course. The file that had documented the pattern, the signature, the impossible engagements across a redacted theater in a redacted year. The file existed. He could see its catalog entry. Its contents were gone. Not just redacted, removed, wiped. A clean empty folder with a timestamp showing that the contents had been deleted 18 months ago by an authorization code that resolved to a department he had never heard of, operating under a designation that didn't appear in any organizational chart he had access to. Somebody had cleaned the record. Harlow closed his terminal and sat in the gray morning light of the base office and thought about what that meant. There were 2 explanations for a deleted file. The first was that the subject was dead, and the file had been archived in the routine way dead subjects' files were archived. The second was that the subject was alive, was still operating, and the file had been cleaned so that the subject could continue to operate without a record that could be followed. Which meant there was an organization or something that knew this man existed, knew what he was doing, and had decided that the best support they could offer was an absence of evidence. He had to know. He requested the drone footage from the extraction approach. Multiple files, 2 different platforms, total coverage of the area. He sat with the footage for 3 hours, running it forward and backward, adjusting the image processing parameters, enhancing the frames that covered the estimated shot origin zone. Most of it was rain, cloud, thermal wash, the kind of footage that looks like abstract art and tells you nothing. At the 2-hour 40-minute mark of the 3rd reel, he found it. 1 frame, a single moment between 2 bursts of dense rain, a figure on a ridgeline that the map said wasn't there. Standing, not crouching, not prone, standing against a sky that was the color of a bruise, facing away from the camera. The thermal signature was faint, as if the figure had been managing their own heat signature, limiting the infrared footprint. Tall, still, carrying a system that resolved in the blurred frame as a long-range precision rifle with a scope that caught a single pixel of reflected light. Standing where no one was supposed to be, watching the wasteland below. In the frame before and after rain, nothing. Just rain. Harlow stared at that single frame for a long time. He pulled the audio file from his own kit, the operational recording that his equipment made automatically during every engagement. He found the moment he had stopped at the helicopter door, the second he had turned back, the 2 seconds he had looked at the ridge. In the audio, at the very end of those 2 seconds, there is a sound. Not a shot. Not rain. Not wind. A single quiet impact. Metal on earth. Close within 20 meters. The sound of something falling or being placed. Deliberate. The sound of someone who understood that the recording was running and had made a conscious decision to leave a mark that would survive the night. Harlow returned to the field the following week. He told no one why. He signed out a vehicle on a training pretext and drove 2 hours on roads that narrowed to tracks and then to pale suggestions of tracks before he parked on open ground and walked the remaining kilometers on foot. The wasteland in dry weather was a different creature than the wasteland in rain. Pale, cracked. The clay had dried into a mosaic of small fracture lines, like a map of something without a name. The brush had straightened back up, brittle and stiff, and the air had the smell of dust rather than earth. He walked it slowly. The 600 meters from the LZ back to the position, he walked it the way he had moved through it that night, with the full attention of someone reading rather than traveling, letting the ground tell him what it remembered. At the edge of the position, the flat ground just south of where the helicopter had sat, he found it, pressed into the earth. Barely visible against the pale clay, a spent cartridge casing, standard caliber, the kind that could have come from anywhere, except for 2 things. First, it was standing upright, not ejected from a firearm. Ejected casings tumble and fall and lie flat where they land. This one was standing, base down, set into a small divot in the earth, with the deliberateness of something placed rather than discarded. The kind of deliberateness that takes an extra second. The kind of extra second that means the person doing it wanted it found. Second, the primer had been struck, the round had been fired, but the casing itself had been carried, brought here, from 900 meters away, through rain and darkness, carried across 600 meters of open ground that had been an active firefight 30 minutes before that casing was placed. Someone had moved through the space between the origin point and this spot after the extraction, in conditions that were still dangerous, to leave one small object in one specific location, for one specific person. Harlow picked it up, turned it in his fingers. The metal was cold, smooth, unremarkable. It looked like every other casing he had ever seen. It told him nothing that he didn't already know, and it confirmed everything he had already guessed. He looked at the wasteland around him, the cracked earth, the dead brush, the pale sky that held no weather and offered no information. The emptiness was complete and convincing. If you hadn't been here that night, you would look at this ground and conclude that nothing had ever happened here, that nothing had ever stood on this ridge or in this valley, or between these cracked and featureless hills. He thought about the frame on the drone footage, the standing figure, the thermal signature that was too faint, too managed, too controlled to be accidental. Someone who understood surveillance systems, someone who had known exactly how much of a signature to leave enough to be found by someone looking, not enough to be found by routine analysis. He thought about the deleted file, and he thought about the people who had deleted it. The authorization code that resolved to a department without a name, the clean and empty folder, the active maintenance of an absence. He had worked in organizations that buried inconvenient information, and he had worked in organizations that protected sensitive operations, and he understood the difference between the two. This felt like the second. Someone was not hiding a failure. Someone was protecting a capability. He thought about Sergeant Major Graves and his careful distinction. Using a name gives you the feeling of understanding something you don't understand. He understood, standing in that pale wasteland with the casing in his hand, that he was never going to have a name. He was never going to have a face. He was never going to have an explanation that would satisfy an after-action report or a classified archive or a department without a name. He was going to have 7 men who walked out of a kill zone. He was going to have this casing. He was going to have a single blurred frame from a drone feed. And he was going to have a pattern 323 that he would hear in his memory on certain nights for the rest of his life. That was what he had. He thought about Whitfield's voice when the young corporal had asked who, and Harlow had said nobody. He thought about what Whitfield would carry from this night forward, how it would change the way the young man understood operations, understood limits, understood what was and wasn't possible. He thought about Weld's arm and the way the young corporal had run the last 100 meters on willpower, and the particular stubbornness of someone who has decided they are not going to be the reason the team stops moving. He thought about Price's hands, working in the mud and the rain without a tremor. He thought about all of them, all 7. The gap between 7 going in and 7 coming out was supposed to have been unbridgeable. Someone had bridged it anyway, for reasons that would never appear in any record, in a manner that would never be explained, and was gone. He thought about his daughter, the gap in her front teeth, the birthday he had come home for after all. He thought about the drive home from the base, and the way she had run down the front steps before he had finished parking the car, and how he had caught her and held on a beat longer than usual without explaining why, and how she had not asked why, because she was 8 years old. And the thing about being 8 is that you accept love without needing its reasons. He closed his hand around the casing. There was no sound, no movement. The wasteland was empty in every direction, flat and cracked and silent under the pale morning sky. But he had the feeling, the specific, precise, certain feeling of being watched. Not in a threatening way. Not in the way that means danger. Not in the way that raises the hairs on your arm and brings your hand to your weapon. In the way that someone watches to make sure you found what they left for you. The patient attention of someone at a distance who has done something and wants to know whether it was received. Not needing acknowledgement, just observing whether the connection was made. He lifted the casing once. A single gesture, slight, directed at nothing and at everything, at the empty cracked ground, and the empty pale sky, and the ridge that the map said didn't exist. He said nothing. Some acknowledgements don't need words. Some debts are too large to be settled with language and too real to be carried without expression. The raised casing was enough. It was everything. He stood there for one moment longer. Then he turned and walked back toward his vehicle, his boots crunching softly on the cracked clay, leaving no marks that the next wind wouldn't erase. He never found Subject 7. Officially, Subject 7 had never existed. The file was gone. The record was clean. The after-action report said inconclusive and moved on. No radar signature. No ground track. No confirmed identity. No photograph that resolved into a face. Nothing. Just a pattern. 323. A pause that counted like breathing. A signature written in empty air across a dozen engagements in a dozen places where men who were supposed to die had come home instead. In the months that followed, Harlow asked carefully through the indirect channels that experienced professionals use when they want information without creating a record of wanting it. He asked combat veterans from different branches. In the careful oblique way you ask when you're not certain the question is welcome. 3 of them, without prompting, without him providing details, described the same thing. Fire from an impossible angle. The particular quality of the silence before it. The clean departure that left nothing behind. The sense, afterward, of having been watched over by something that operated outside every category they had been trained to recognize. Each one described it differently. Each one arrived at the same center. We should have died. We didn't. Something was out there. We still don't know what. None of them had names for it. Some had stopped looking for one. And somewhere in a different wasteland, under a different rain, watching a different team that didn't yet know what was coming, perhaps still watching, patient, unhurried, present, without existence.